It's been 15 years since the release of Doom 3, and in that time frame, the game has become pretty controversial for how it departs from the style set out by its legendary predecessors. And with the series having recently been revived in a bombastic action-first kind of way thanks to the 2016 reboot and the upcoming Doom Eternal, Doom 3 sticks out like a sore thumb even more when compared to the series at large. Foregoing much of the running and the gunning of the classics, Doom 3 opted for a much slower, horror-tinged, and atmospheric take on the idea of hell invading a space station. Drawing heavy influence from Half-Life, System Shock 2, and I'd argue the film Event Horizon, Doom 3 was a critical and commercial success on release that also happened to split the fanbase right down the middle. Opinions ranged from loving the game's bold new direction for the long dormant series, reviling it for failing to capture the magic of the first two games which came before, and everything else in between. I'll just get out my own stance on the game up front. I do genuinely like Doom 3. It's flawed, and of the four mainline Doom games, it's easily my least favorite, but Doom 3 is a competent enough shooter with some genuinely brilliant elements mixed in. Seriously, there are things Doom 3 did in 2004 that games took 5 years or longer to catch up to. It was shockingly forward-thinking. Make no mistake, Doom 3 was by no means a cynical cash grab by id to capitalize on the horror game market. This was a passion project through and through. A small moment towards the game's conclusion always stuck out to me. Just before you enter the final boss area, you can find a hidden button that looks like the id Software logo. Press it, and a secret room opens up, which contains a fourth wall breaking text file that has little comments from each member of the staff on it. These range from thank you notes to little jokes and such. I had to smile while reading all of them because it helps to showcase how much Doom 3 really was a labor of love for those who worked on it. Having said that though, Doom 3 is an extremely flawed game, and there are numerous odd inclusions and outright screw-ups that act as valid reasons to just outright not enjoy it. The number one most jarring shift in priorities compared to Doom 1 and 2 was the pace. In comparison to how you were running around at 60 miles per hour in those games, blasting away anything that popped in your path as fast as you could, Doom 3 comparatively brought the entire experience to a screeching halt. The guns fire slower, the default walking speed is slower, there are less enemies on screen at a time than in even Doom's E1M1 for a large chunk of the game, and so on. The gunplay in general for a sizable chunk of the game is just downright poor on top of that, with most weapons at the Doom 3 guys' disposal being weak and sounding even worse. On top of that, Doom 3 commits one of the worst sins a first-person shooter, let alone a Doom game, can. Give the player a bad shotgun. In any game, this is a letdown, but the original Doom was famous for how the pump action was the reliable workhorse for pretty much the entire game. In Doom 3, it's slow to fire, and you pretty much have to Eskimo kiss an enemy for it to do any real damage. Outside of the pitiful shotgun, I think a lot of the issues with Doom 3's gunplay in its first half, and why a lot of fans found it to be pretty clunky on first impression, is because the enemies for the most part don't seem to react to being shot. In the original Doom, when you shot a demon, usually they would enter a stun animation for a brief moment, allowing you to get another shot in if the first didn't kill them, and potentially stop them from throwing out an attack of their own. This made somewhat weak weapons like the chain gun useful, because you could stun lock individual enemies with it. In Doom 3, most enemies seem to ignore being shot from the early game weapons, with even the ranged machine gun not doing much to stun any of them. This is especially annoying with the hit scan enemies, who can tank through your shots while rapidly firing on you. At the very least with the Imps, Hell Knights, and Revenants, you have the ability to shoot their attacks out of the air, which in all honesty is a pretty clever idea. However, what makes taking any damage in this game annoying is how the screen will violently shake each time you take a hit. It adds nothing to the combat and pretty much only serves to piss off the player. When you pair the screen shake with the surprise attacks from jumping imps and trigger-happy chain gunners just standing behind doors, you're gonna be in for a bad time. I swear, jumping imps are Doom 3's favorite party trick, and it gets old real fast. Frankly, Doom 3 doesn't do itself any favors with how it leaves a first impression. While I can definitely appreciate the opening, as it does give a nice look into what the 9 to 5 at the UAC Mars base looks like, with some spooky foreshadowing thrown in, once you get to the first enemy, it loses my interest. The original Doom kinda sucked with how its pistol worked, sure, but Doom 3 starting the player off in a room with a single zombie and this dinky little pop gun really does not set the ideal tone. Honestly, the first third of the game has this issue all throughout. Enemies tend to be few in number, with maybe 2 or 3 around at a time, and you'll be primarily fighting really boring enemies like the zombies, or outright annoying ones like the security soldiers. It isn't all doom and gloom, though. Just get it? Because, like, the name of the game is Doom, and fuck, I'm hilarious. Because Doom 3 is still an older id Software shooter at heart, and because of that, it benefits from the company's mastery of first-person shooter player movement. It has nailed 3D FPS traversal from the first Quake up to even Rage of all games, and Doom 3 is certainly no exception. You can bunny hop, strafe jump, play with altitude to mess with enemy aim, build jumping speed around corners like your Mario hopping dimensions, it's all good stuff. Sadly, it cannot be all good news, because 2 issues really hold back the fun you can have with the player movement. Probably the first one you'll notice is the questionable inclusion of a stamina bar, which controls how long the player can sprint for. This was an issue in Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and it's even worse here. When these types of games introduce stamina into the mix, the ability to pull off the more entertaining movement options becomes a little less convenient. In its defense, Doom 3 was trying to go for an action horror style though, so it's understandable why they'd want to discourage goofy maneuvers like bunny hopping. The other way that these kinds of actions are discouraged is the cramped level geometry, which completely kills your momentum each time you really start to get into a groove. Once again though, these are petty personal gripes asking for accommodations that run directly against what id was trying to do with Doom 3. Hell, a good chunk of the grievances with Doom 3 as a shooter can easily be chalked up to the true focus of Doom 3, which is to try and be a horror game. The slower pace and lesser gunplay can all be seen as consequences of that new direction. In that respect, it's only fair to try and judge how Doom 3 handles its horror aspects. And looking back on it, it actually handles these elements a little bit better than most give it credit for. The one area I think Doom 3 truly does excel at is the spooky atmosphere it creates, due in large part to the game's stellar lighting. id Tech 4's biggest claim to fame was how it handled complex and dynamic lighting, and as an extended tech demo to show that off, Doom 3 does not fail to impress. The contrast between the lit areas and those draped in darkness is very well handled, and the transition between the light and the dark is both smooth and, lacking a better word for it, realistic. Another thing that stuck out while playing Doom 3 again after many years is how carefully crafted the in-game lighting really is. For context, I used the original release of the game for the video without the duct tape mod, and purposely avoided the BFG edition for, among other reasons, its use of the mounted flashlight. The choice for Doom 3 to have the flashlight be a separate item from the guns when paired with the admittedly rather extreme amounts of darkness in the game was certainly a controversial one. Honestly though, playing the vanilla game without mods actually shows off why, at least in my opinion, the choice was the right call. Everyone's heard the story of the Half-Life 2 commentary, where Gabe Newell or whoever else explains how Valve uses light sources to telegraph the intended path to the player without putting a big old arrow on their HUD. And keeping that idea in mind while playing Doom 3 really went to show just how carefully crafted much of the darkness is. Sure, there are spots where it's just pitch black and you really do have to use the flashlight. For the most part though, the game does a pretty bang up job of placing light sources in just the right places, with just the right amount to see where you need to go, but still feel a little anxious about what might be hiding around the corner. With only those few exceptions, Doom 3 makes great use of its lighting for both navigation and keeping the player on edge for potential attacks, and even has some neat small details like how gunfire and enemy fireballs can light up a dark room for a moment. While Doom 3 and its plastic character faces may have aged pretty poorly, the lighting effects are still pretty damn impressive today, outclassing some modern games going for similar effects. Doom 3's attention to detail and its presentation also give it a leg up in the horror department. The short section where you get to explore the UAC at the game's opening, paired with the text and audio logs all about the day-to-day going-ons, portray the UAC as both a believably lived-in and mundanely terrible workplace. One I'm pretty sure most of us are able to relate to. Hell, I'm writing this script for one of those types of places right now. That's like meta or something. What makes it interesting rather than just disheartening to reflect on is how a few of the NPCs and all of the logs throughout the game detail how the UAC was gradually corrupted by Hell, the implication being that the invasion was a quiet one. The Hell portal actually opening just being the climax of a very long build-up, full of small occurrences of supernatural events and shady conduct from the UAC higher-ups is an interesting spin on the idea of Hell leaking into a futuristic space station. It is worth noting though that despite all of the extra bells and whistles from the game's logs straight out of System Shock's playbook, Doom 3's actual plot is only slightly less bare bones than the text scrolls from the original game. This is due in large part to the fact that Doom 3, despite the number, is actually a remake of the first game. Okay, maybe a remake of the first game, it's not exactly clear, but the bottom line is that Doom 3 is essentially just the first game given a far richer backstory and presented in a much more grounded light, and that's pretty cool. The coolest part of this grounded presentation is seeing how id reinterpreted the classic staples of Doom's gameplay. Despite what a lot of fans may say when they accuse Doom 3 of not being a Doom game, the title actually sticks fairly close to the framework of Doom 1 and 2. I'd argue being a more faithful retro shooter than Doom 2016 was. Doom 3's levels follow the exact same structure as the originals. The goal is to get from point A to point B, the end goal usually being a switch of some kind. The path is usually blocked by keys strung about the halls, and you have to explore the semi-open level to find them while either killing demons or ignoring those you can just run away from. If you're inclined to explore, you can collect secret resource stashes along the way. Add in all of the more surface level trappings of retro FPS design, like carrying all your weapons at once and a health and armor system, and Doom 3 does in fact share some common blood with games from first-person shooters' golden era. Don't misunderstand, I'm not saying Doom 3 is actually a retro shooter or something, or that it's exactly like the original Doom games. We already went over how it isn't, let's not get mixed up here. What I did want to highlight was how Doom 3 keeps all of these classic Doom elements while reimagining them for its more subdued post-Half-Life stylings. The old red, blue, and yellow keys are now personnel ID cards with specific security clearances, the hidden wall style secrets are replaced with storage lockers, the passcodes for which are hidden in UAC staff emails, the end level square switches become in-game touchscreen interfaces, the list goes on. Point is, Doom 3 does a lot to try and immerse the player into its world, and the effort to reimagine classic Doom tropes in a more believable light is both clever and beneficial for getting the player sucked in. So yeah, Doom 3 fully embodies that meme buzzword immersion, gets you all sucked in with its great atmosphere and setting building, when all of a sudden an imp jumps out of a door at you or an enemy spawns both in front of and behind you, usually behind a closed door that you just walked through, so it'll get really spooked when you turn around and see it. A seemingly endless wave of upside down spider heads will come at you, so on and so forth. For as good as Doom 3 is at setting the scene, the actual follow through of the scares is bland and pretty predictable. In the game's defense, these are fairly inoffensive when they first happen, but the issue here lies in repetition. I'd say by the first hour or so of the game, maybe an hour and a half in, you've seen pretty much every type of scare the game has to offer. Predictability setting in so early on, Doom 3 being roughly a 6 to 7 hour game, is bad enough, but a horror game becoming predictable that early, that's a serious issue. For everything that Doom 3 does well, the sheer predictability of it, paired with the poor gunplay of the game's first half, eventually lead to the game just becoming boring. You're shooting the same boring enemies with the same boring guns, which is unfortunate because I really can't stress enough how well Doom 3 nails the overall atmosphere. The game's sound design does play a lesser degree in maintaining that atmosphere, outside of the poor gun sound effects. The sounds of the demons are interesting and let you discern what you're facing before you're seeing it, the mark of a good enemy soundbite. The game has pretty decent directional audio too, with the diegetic audio all around you placing you smack dab into a falling apart space station, trying to discern if the groan down the dark hall was a pipe or a monster scurrying around. One major area where Doom 3 drops the ball in the audio department though is the soundtrack. Doom as a series is well known for its rock and metal music, with composer Bobby Prince pretty infamously repurposing guitar riffs from popular metal songs and putting them into MIDI formats. Doom 3 sets up a good initial impression with a pretty banging title screen theme, But it all goes downhill once you play the game for a while and realize that you really haven't heard much of anything. Yeah, Doom 3 subscribes to the idea that the best soundtrack for a horror game is no soundtrack, or at the very least an extremely minimalist one. Even when there is in-game music, you probably aren't going to register it. Angry-ass metal is pretty core to the Doom identity, so the absence of it from this game is a real knock against it. A counter-argument one might pose is that, because Doom 3 is a horror game, the lack of a fast and heavy soundtrack makes sense. After all, that kind of stuff blaring in the background would go against the game's immersive atmosphere, which is something I definitely stand by as being Doom 3's strong point. My straw man does make a fair point, but the lack of a prominent soundtrack is itself a mistake when you consider that two other atmospheric first-person shooters which predate Doom 3 avoided this issue. Doom 64, while not developed by id Software in-house, is considered by some the real Doom 3. Essentially a total conversion for Doom 2, it has all of the rip-roaring action one would want from a Doom game, while also holding a reputation for being pretty damn unsettling despite that. The hair-raising vibe that Doom 64 gives off is due entirely to its very bizarre soundtrack, all of which is this slow-burn synth drone that mixes in wails and even babies crying into the tracks. It's pretty spooky stuff, and really does give off the atmosphere of a doomed voyage into hell itself. If an out-of-house Doom game isn't enough for an example, how about an in-house developed id Software shooter? Despite the advances in tech, at its core Quake is a Doom-style shooter, but replaces the upbeat MIDI metal with true blue industrial. Words cannot do this one justice, just have a listen to a few tracks. As action-packed as Quake is, this grimy soundtrack paired with the muted aesthetic merging science fiction tech, gluey medieval locales, and Lovecraftian touches give it an atmosphere which is pretty much unparalleled to this day. Quake? Now that's a good game right there. The legitimacy of Quake's industrial styling is due to the sound design being handled entirely by living legend Trent Reznor, an acclaimed composer, trailblazer of that sweet 1990s edge, and mastermind behind 9 Inch Nails. Trent composed Quake fresh off of the Downward Spiral, and from the title track alone you can feel the same mechanical rage bleeding in. Funny thing is, Trent was actually supposed to do the music for Doom 3 as well, but for one reason or another he had to back out of the project. It's a crying shame too, because Doom 3's atmosphere combined with whatever soundscape he could have cooked up would have been one hell of a treat. So, if anyone has been paying attention, when speaking in heavily critical terms about Doom 3's actual gameplay, I use the caveat of the first half a couple of times. Well, here's the thing. While Doom 3's focus on horror gimped the gunplay for the first half of the game, the second half beginning around the monorail chapter is when things start to get a little bit more interesting. Honestly, after those first few hours, Doom 3 actually starts to get pretty fun. The speed of the game picks up, with more enemies appearing more frequently. Hit-scan enemies show up less, with more interesting enemies like the Mancubus, Archvile, and Hell Knight getting introduced. And to top it off, you start to get weapons that are actually pretty damn fun to use, like the chain gun, plasma rifle, rocket launcher, and BFG, with ammo for all of your toys being given out in relative abundance provided you're actively hunting for secrets. Doom 3 starts to feel like a pretty decent action game at this point, while still retaining the aspects that made it captivating from the beginning. And then things all go to hell. Literally, and this is a very good thing. Hell is when Doom 3 really started to get on my good side. The art direction gets a much needed variety, with the fire and brimstone aesthetic one would expect from hell being mixed with the blood-red cosmos overhead. Some real-ass metal imagery gets put in place, with skulls everywhere, hanging tortured corpses, and screams of the damned being heard in the background. It's kind of like if Zen from Half-Life merged with the Slayer album cover. It's all good stuff. The actual arenas you fight in get wider too, so hopping around like an idiot becomes a real viable strategy again. And it's pretty much just a non-stop combat gauntlet once the first enemy spawns in. From hell all the way to the finish, Doom 3 finally cuts loose and becomes a downright fun, if still flawed, shooter. The core issues never leave. The screen shake on getting hit is beyond irritating by this point. About half of the weapons lack any real punch, with enemies being able to tank through a lot of them. The restrictive level geometry doesn't allow for more open-ended movement in combat, and so on. And this is all dancing around the biggest issue with giving full praise to Doom 3 for the entertaining second half swerve. Considering the game's roughly 6 or 7 hours long, you'll be waiting about 3 hours for things to really start to get going, and for the shooting in this shooting game to get really interesting. As an action game, Doom 3 is a slow and clunky first-person shooter for that first half. As a horror game, it excels at building up to scares, but relies on a limited bag of tricks for the actual delivery of them. In both cases though, these valleys are brought up by the game's peaks. Doom 3's attention to detail to the world and atmosphere is great. The dedication to making the UAC seem like a real workplace gone to hell is effective. And black screen meme aside, its lighting effects are still pretty top notch to this day. And once it starts rolling, Doom 3 is a fun shooter, some pretty kick-ass fights. Despite what some people might say about it not being a bad game, just a bad Doom game, Doom 3 does successfully reinterpret the structure of Doom 1 and 2 into a more grounded style. Despite the conflicting design between the horror and the action halves, Doom 3 does keep the series' spirit alive, admittedly all the while rightfully earning its reputation as the black sheep of the bunch.